righty, everybody. Welcome to episode 39 of Box Daily. My name is Jon Alvarado, and I'm joined by Hagen Ruff, CEO of Chava Wind, who will be unpacking lightweight alternative energy solutions for the modern consumer. Say hello, Hagen.
And I'm glad you actually pronounced my name really well, the German way of pronouncing it.
Well, we spent enough time the last couple of weeks back and forth discussing Chava and the amazing product that you guys have been developing. Highly innovative, falls well within our core values. I'm really excited to have you on the show today, Hagen.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Glad to be here.
So, Hagen, on that, you're from Germany. Can you talk to your audience a little bit about your background and the story behind the story that got you to Chava and starting this amazing
Right. I mean, I grew up in Stuttgart, a southwestern sort of industrial center of Germany where all the fancy cars are made and, a lot of other industrial global heavyweights are located. And so I had a natural interest in energy from the very get-go. Even when I was young, I was dreaming about some sort of energy sources, and I've always been following, even as a teenager, the developments of, nuclear fusion and, how to basically, I grew up basically just as a background in the age when Chernobyl really affected us, and, there was fallout and radioactive rain coming down over Germany even after that disaster for years to come. And, there was increased measurements of radioactivity. So finding different sources of energy was always on my mind, even as a teenager, which I was when that happened, basically. So, and I studied mechanical engineering with a master's in Germany, and then I kind of started my career in IT with the big five consulting firms. At that time, it was called Anderson Consulting, and now it's called Accenture, which was great. I really enjoyed that sort of opportunity to go around the world on projects. I spent a couple of years in Hong Kong. I had some projects in Germany and did lots of training and visits to the US. And then I basically, at some point decided I do want to, take a job in New York, which was, I was offered. And so that was my basically ticket to an H-1B visa in the US. Initially, I was only planning to be there for like 9 months of, this project duration, but how life goes, I'm still here. That was in 1996, actually. So, become a naturalized citizen since, and, set up my own company in IT consulting. It was called Business Information Solutions. We focused on large enterprise clients and basically business intelligence software to get better analytics out of their transactional systems. Yeah. And it grew really fast. I mean, we set that up in the late 90s, and, that was the wave of IT consulting, and it grew dramatically within a few years to about 240 people. And then we were bought out by Sapient Corporation, Cambridge, Massachusetts company that was NASDAQ listed at the time. Got a bit of a taste of being on a global leadership team of a public company. And then after my earnout, I decided, well, I've got the financial independence. I want to go back to sort of my old dreams of energy. And, I'm an engineer. I understand a lot of the things, even though I up until then never really worked as an engineer. So I had the background. I followed a lot of things, but I never worked as an engineer. I was basically in software consulting and management, and it served me well. I mean, I don't complain. But so in 2008, when I started research on more kind of speculative energy projects, I was fascinated by some sort of Tesla. I mean, not Tesla Motors, but Nikola Tesla technologies, and by phenomena that people have discovered.
The original Tesla.
The original Tesla, exactly. Because, if you talk about Tesla nowadays, everybody thinks about Tesla Motors, right? And, Tesla Motors got the best name out there because he really is he was an innovator, at the verge of crazy. I mean, he died a poor man, and he was kind of shunned a little bit by the mainstream society because people call him crazy with all his ideas. He was way ahead of his time. And so this name is perfect for Tesla Motors, basically. And then 20 years after his death, he got the Nobel Prize for his work, basically.
That's right.
And so, I mean, he was a genius, and it fascinated me what's been out there and what phenomena people are researching on. And of course, it's very controversial. And there's a lot of sort of conflict with mainstream science. And, you almost like when you do research in this field, you get attacked by people almost like viciously. They call you like a snake oil seller or whatever, even if you put your own money into researching those type of things, because it kind of deviates from sort of the within the box thinking of current mainstream textbook science, basically, right? It was fascinating. We had quite some success with lab experiments and phenomena that I still found very interesting and fascinating, but we never had the means to really scale it to like a meaningful production of energy or something that can actually be used. It's basically technologies that can use surrounding energy and convert it into useful energy, like, electron spin energy into electron flows that could be used as electricity.
Right.
The power devices, things like that. But again, I funded myself out of my own, sort of funds that I gained over the years in IT projects in southern Germany and in Berlin. We had a research facility there we bought from the old East German government. And then we had a lab in Adelaide, Australia. We had one in Spokane, Washington. We had one in Florida. So, it was almost a global undertaking with at times up to 14 people researching on those things. So it wasn't a tiny little garage thing. We quite had, we had quite some budgets flowing in there on a regular basis, but again, not enough to get it to the next level. And then in 2013, the opportunity with the vertical axis wind turbine came around. A friend of mine in Japan called me up, and, after Fukushima, that turned off most of the nuclear power plants at the time, which, by the way, are turned back on by now. But Japan, in basically, they brought out incentives for, all kinds of renewable energy, and small wind up to 20 kilowatts on the inverter was one of the pillars that they brought out huge incentives, which was 55 cents per kilowatt hour. So they were looking for products in the market that were certified, reliable, but also aesthetic. I mean, they didn't like those horizontal propellers much, because, small wind is on-site power generation, by definition, is close to where people live. So we were tasked with a market study globally on what products were out there. We found a 3 kilowatt machine that was designed by, and basically was funded by Sandia Labs in conjunction with a Russian space research lab at the time, when the Russian-American relationships were still intact. But that funding dried out. But we looked at their technology. It was a quite good product, but it wasn't quite there yet. Also, it wasn't the size we're looking for. So we basically decided we develop our own product that meets all of the aesthetic requirements. It has got to be a small footprint. It's got to resemble nature, because people live close to it. Japan is a very densely populated, and they want to keep sort of the aesthetics in place. And there wasn't any product, not even close, that's out there that's also certified, because it has to go through a rigorous certification process and testing to meet those requirements. So we thought, well, we're going to embark on this. We put together a budget and a plan, sat down with engineers and scientists, and we thought, well, we can do it probably in 3 years and $3 million. And so it's, when we actually got started, now we're basically about 7 years and $7 million into it. We had a couple of reiterations of design we had to do. And, it's not, I learned my lesson. I was in engineering throughout that time. I worked with, our team was, I think we peaked out at like 17 people that were scientists and engineers from also globally from all over the world that we pulled in, that had experience in wind energy and computer simulations of airfoils and all the other structural things, carbon composite experts to make the blades. So we brought quite a team together, and it was quite a burn rate, but we had some setbacks. So we had to do redesign. And, my lesson learned is like, it's not like in software projects, you have a go live date and you just make everything possible happen. You go live with a few bugs, and then you kind of like, change the process and fix them as you go. Or sometimes you can apply fixes quite quickly overnight, and software that doesn't exactly do what people are set out to do. There's a lot of things you can do quickly, but with a physical product, sometimes there's months. We in some of the iterations, it took us like 8 months to go back into the testing mode, because you got to basically sit back, redesign, resimulate on the computer, make all the engineering changes, retrofit it, and then you have to make a prototype manufacturing of those retrofitted parts. Then you got to test the parts. You got to basically reestablish it back on the actual turbine. and then start testing again. And those, I mean, just those cycles are much longer than the software. So that was kind of my lesson learned.
So Hagen, take it. Actually, something that's very interesting about your story is the fact that you're a software tech executive turned renewable energy CEO.
Right.
And, one of the interesting things to me is getting to talk to people like you who lived through the dot-com boom.
Right.
In the early 2000s. And I sometimes ponder if that moment hadn't happened for technology, for technology as it relates to software, would software and the web, 1.0, which led to 2.0, et cetera, would that have taken off? Talk to me for a few seconds, if you would, about the tech boom. And what I want to do is, I fundamentally think that renewable hasn't had that tech boom moment yet. It hasn't.
I mean, you're absolutely right. We haven't really invented anything disruptive yet with renewables. I mean, you could argue that, remember the movie Kill the Electric Car? GM brought out that like egg-looking ugly little thing that was called GM's EV back in the 80s, basically, and it just died off. Although it was not too bad from an engineering perspective, but people weren't ready. And just like there were smartphones that came out in the 90s that just really didn't take off until Apple really made a product happen that was usable for the masses. And then smartphones that basically integrated your whole calendar and planning and internet access and phone calls and texting all into one device. There were products years prior to that. I mean, I remember I had one in the 90s, but it was just a little more clumsy. And it's almost like the electric car. Tesla brought it to, just like Apple did with the iPhone, Tesla brought it into a stage where it's mass compatible, basically, right? People like it. It's a smooth process, not just the car is smooth, but the whole process with the stations that he built everywhere, the recharging stations. So he thought about the whole process, and it actually got electric mobility off the ground. And I think it's going to obviously explode over the next 10 years. There's no doubt in my mind. It's just the right thing to do, and it's also technologically it's a much simpler car. So eventually they will be cheaper than combustion engine cars, which are highly complex, right? And so they have about 100-year development advantage over, battery technology has almost made no advances in 100 years, whereas combustion engines went from the initial tin Lizzies to where we are today with modern engines, right? So, I think electric mobility is the way to go. So tech, there's a lot of similarity there, but, we haven't really had that breakthrough in energy generation products, like we did in electric mobility, right? Electric mobility is an application of renewables, but, it doesn't rely solely on renewables. And we have not had any disruptive breakthrough of technology in renewables, right? Wind turbines have been around for a long time. They've been gradually getting better and bigger, mostly bigger. And so in the small wind, sort of space, which is on site, at the point of usage, power generation, I haven't seen anything revolutionary coming out in decades, basically. Solar has made gradual progress. I mean, we have to say there's probably a tipping point that solar has become mainstream and it's become cheaper for people to use their own solar. So that's actually it's an evolutionary, I wouldn't say it's a revolution, but, if you look at from the initial cost of solar, which was prohibitive, to where we are today, the evolutionary process is phenomenal, right? So there's quite a bit of a progress, but solar is not applicable everywhere. It takes a lot of space. So there's a lot of applications where it's windy and in northern climate where the wind doesn't shine. I'm a solar investor, by the way, myself. And I got quite a bit of experience with it. It doesn't apply everywhere. And, wind has applications where it's superior to solar and of course, vice versa. But in many cases, the combination of wind and solar for off-grid or smart grid systems is the best combination with batteries, basically. Absolutely. But again, no super breakthrough, neither in battery technology, which has gradually gone better, but no real sort of like quantum leap where we say, well, this is really gonna make a difference.
Exactly.
Right? So,
and that's the piece of education that I think is going to be very insightful for a lot of us as we start to dig into this space. And I think we're starting to see regulatory pressures begin to push the market towards that direction and build more awareness, i.e. gas prices in the States, in Europe. Obviously, the cost of energy has gone up and they've, also gas prices skyrocketing.
Yeah.
This is coming into the forefront quickly, and I suspect that there is a boom that is on the horizon.
I think this whole notion that renewable energy is like the toys for the privileged or the activists, right?
Wow.
I think it's gradually watering down, because if you see some sort of more right-wing leaning, notions, you think that, well, oil and gas is basically the bread and butter. We won't let them take from us. And those green activists are just trying to basically ram sort of their renewable technology down our throat. It's almost, people are getting smarter. They see through that it's actually the opposite. If you look at oil and gas, if you look at fossil fuels, it's controlled by conglomerates, by cartels, that it's not really a free market, right? And you're totally dependent. There's nothing you can do, to fill up your gas if the gas goes up to $5 a gallon, right? There's nothing else you can do. You can't just say, oh, today gas is expensive, I'm going to use, propane, or, I'm going to use electricity. It's just not, we don't have the technology. So you just have to suck it up, and it's a global prize. And in many cases, that money actually goes to our adversaries, not to people that, actually create American jobs necessarily. Although, of course, there's more production with higher prices, right? But, if you look at renewables, that's the total freedom of energy. So all the production is done in the United States, all the maintenance of those assets, the deployment of the assets, the installation jobs, the repairmen, all those people are American jobs. So, or wherever those, in Europe, it will be European jobs, right? So that's not a global dependency you have. It's the freedom that you have, those decentralized assets in your own place, and you can control them basically, right? And by the way, they've gotten now cheaper than some comparable fossil fuels, right? So that's the irony of this whole notion still, that renewables is just that privilege of activists or like left-wing liberals or whatever. So it's actually become sort of a symbol of energy freedom. And I think more and more people are getting that.
Hearing you say the word decentralization just got the wheels turning in my head, because it's very much what the blockchain is.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And so to think of applications of decentralization outside of software, i.e. energy, is mind-blowing, because it's actually happening. We're taking that energy source away from the folks who essentially administer it and have control of it.
Exactly.
And I think this is a great segue into the flagship product over at Chava. Hagen, talk to us about your guys' flagship product and how that's been coming along over the last year.
Just one sec before I go there on the decentralization, because there's like two levels of it. And a lot of people that just like see decentralized power production central. There's really decentralized power production is smaller power plants that still feed into the grid, right? And then on-site power generation, which is the ultimate level of decentral power, is basically can bypass the grid completely. So there's like the large, big power plants, the nuclear power plants, central, serving a lot of people. There's the decentral, smaller power plants feeding into the grid, serving through a distribution network people. But then there is the last level, which is on-site power production and microgrids. And that's the game we're playing with our Windleaf 2500. That's kind of the segue into our product. And so we really don't play and compete with the big wind turbines, because all of them have to feed into the grid. Our product, again, is on-site. We can run it in a microgrid. We can also grid feed. If people have a grid connection, we can use the grid as a buffer, as like almost like a storage. So if you have net metering and, some states support it, some states don't, then you basically turn a meter backwards in times when you have strong winds and low production and low consumption. And you turn a meter forwards if you have low winds and high consumption. So, it's basically the grid as a buffer, but, you can also run it in off grid. The beauty is, if the grid goes down, which, for example, in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria, it pretty much destroyed their utility grid. There were some remote areas that didn't have power for up to a year, even though the wind generation assets and some solar were still intact, but they couldn't operate because they couldn't feed into the grid. And so if you have on-site power generation, then you don't need the grid. You're basically independent of that. Or, if we get solar flares, and again, I'm not a doomsday prep or anything like that, but if you look at those scenarios where, we had the big outage in the Northeast back in the 90s, actually the early 2000s, which was quite severe. We had the ERCOT outage in Texas about a year ago when people actually died. The electric grid went down. And that's when even some electric mobility providers said, well, we got to look into hardening our grid. with basically microgrids at the EV charging stations. Because if you think about a grid outage with electric mobility being prevalent, I mean, at this juncture, electric mobility is maybe 1% of all mobility in Texas, right? So it didn't really make a big difference. People could still get in a car and go places to survive. If you fast forward and you can't charge your electric car anymore when the grid goes down, then you have a real problem. And so there's a lot of thoughts right now on making charging stations, at least a good portion of it, off-grid capable, where you have on-site generation capabilities, basically, if those things happen. And our product would be a great symbol for EV charging stations along freeway stretches and remote areas, not necessarily in a city, but in more suburban and rural areas.
So talk to us for a few minutes about the Chava wind leaf product and the story behind the name. What the inception of the name?
Gotcha. So again, I don't take personal credit for the inception of the name. It was our Japanese team lead. He basically ran the sort of Japanese operation when we were in the planning stage for the Japanese market. And he basically insisted that it's got to resemble nature. And then when he saw the blade of the turbine, it kind of looks like a leaf. And if you look at a turning leaf, the wind leaf, we just loved it right away. And then the 2500 is basically just a nomenclature for the 25 kilowatt version. And so we stuck with that name since, basically. It was just a brilliant idea of our Japanese friend. And so in terms of size of the wind turbine, I mean, we've been looking at 100 kilowatt, sort of scaled versions because people were asking for that. We also been, asked for smaller versions of half a kilowatt to maybe 10 kilowatts, just scaling it down. But we probably not going to get into the small wind turbine, the micro wind turbine markets for obvious reasons. I mean, we chose the 25 kilowatt for reasons that you have to produce sort of a meaningful amount of energy with a wind turbine product. If you make the effort to establish a wind turbine, it's got to produce a meaningful amount of energy. And again, the 25 kilowatt versus the annual energy production, it's a very tricky thing because a lot of people, they try to compare 25 kilowatts of peak solar with 25 kilowatt on a wind turbine. Now, if you're in a very sunny area, and then it doesn't have a lot of winds, you're probably much better off with solar. But if you go in a northern climate where solar doesn't produce much in winter and you have a lot of cloud cover, and it's very windy, then you are better off you have a much higher annual energy production on a wind turbine on a much lower footprint as well. So solar also has the other issue where, you're basically taking away agricultural farmland if you plant lots of solar panels, whereas wind turbines, they can coexist with agriculture and usage of land, basically, you're the edge of a parking lot and things like that. So there's obviously, pros and cons, and depends on which region you are and how much wind you have and how much solation you have from basically the sun in those specific areas. So we always do a comparison. But again, for microgrids, the combination of solar and wind is obviously the optimal thing because, you basically have two sources where oftentimes you have less in solar in winter, but the winter has stronger winds and then the opposite in summer. So you're kind of offsetting the lows and the highs for microgrids.
How tall is the turbine and how wide is it? Talk to us about the dimensions for a few minutes.
So basically the wind turbine is close to 100 feet tall from the ground, basically, and the rotor itself is about 45 feet of that on the top. So we're substantially off the ground, and that's also for a reason, because those little small micro turbines that people put up on their roof, you can order them on Alibaba. They're cheap, but they typically don't last long at all, and sometimes hurt people by falling apart. They're just for charging laptops and phones. They don't really produce a meaningful amount of energy. There's also the wind. Up to 10 meters off the ground has a so-called ground effect. It gets turbulent. The energy in the wind close to the ground is just not as high. And then you go on roofs where you have certain effects of turbulent air, basically. If you go higher, then obviously you're kind of clearing all those interferences, or many of them. I mean, there's really high tree lines that we don't clear either. So we can't go and naturally grow forests that are that have 100 feet tall trees. Right. That's only for the big wind turbines, right? But, we clear a lot of obstacles with our height, and it's still compatible with, sort of I would say, suburban, rural, and sort of business parks, industrial areas. So that's kind of our target market. We're not targeting so much more urban residential areas with sort of dense residential buildings. That's probably not the ideal thing for our wind turbine. It's too big for that. But if you look into more rural areas, farming, agriculture, business parks, industrial areas, hotels, there's just warehouses, government buildings. There's a lot of applications, telecommunication equipment that's remote. And then again, electric mobility as one of the huge target markets, right? And then big box stores, right, where you have big parking lots. Existing gas stations that need power also typically have big parking lots. So, again, there's a lot of areas. So we've done market studies and by country, what the good wind areas are, what the target markets are. So there's plenty out there. Again, it's not for every area. It's not for every market. It's not for cities necessarily. It's not for low wind areas that have a lot of sun. But, just look at the Caribbean, which is close by to where I live in Miami. Great winds, high power costs, unreliable power supplies, perfect playground for our product.
Absolutely. And with that, what is the commercialization like, and how is it potentially helping open up some opportunities for folks who've never dabbled in this kind of energy before?
Yeah, so the commercialization, we're not in mass production yet. So we've done all the certification testing. We completed that successfully. We're talking to production partners right now. Our goal is not to be a manufacturing outfit. Our goal is to be a technology innovator. So we want to basically have all the components produced by partners. And then we obviously take charge of the support of the product, but also installation, repair, or maintenance has to be done by installation partners. So we have manufacturing partners, we'll have installation partners, but we're going to hold the technology together. We're going to continuously improve it, and we provide the support. So that's our business model. And then we also look at certain regions of the world where we just do complete licensing, where we just say, you take care of everything. You can do your own manufacturing, your own sales. You just pay a certain royalty on a sliding scale for a certain market, basically. So those models are also being discussed at the moment.
Absolutely, Hagen. Last question for me is where do you see the future of renewable going with everything that's happening right now in the world, and some major players where a lot of the energy has been centralized? Where do you see some opportunities for awareness and the future of this incredible industry?
Right. I mean, I'm not demonizing the central power grids. I mean, they serve a very good purpose, basically, in most urban settings and in a lot of areas. So actually, we are thankful to have a power grid that most of the time works, right? And so it's just what feeds into the power grid is not necessarily the very futuristic sort of source of fuel. Nuclear fission, which is basically splitting the atom of current nuclear power plants, they're just not safe enough. They produce a lot of nuclear waste. We don't even know yet where to put it in the future. It will be there for generations, for thousands of years. And then we don't want another catastrophe like Chernobyl, like 3 Mile Island and Harrisburg that we had a near catastrophe, or Fukushima in Japan. So nuclear is kind of controversial, right? Although right now it's an interim thing, it's probably better than using natural gas-fired power plants because of the geopolitical impact. But I see the long-term future in nuclear fusion, which is basically I've been following it again since I was little, and I had some technological interest in that. Fusion, the good thing about fusion, it's very consistent. Like, it's always been another 30 years till we get it. For the last 30 years. So, it's been consistently moving up, but just lately we've made a lot of progress. There were some breakthroughs where, you can basically keep the energy output higher for quite some time. I mean, substantial amount of time measured in seconds, higher than the input. And that's a major breakthrough. So there's a lot of money flowing into nuclear fusion. There's a lot of confidence that, in the next 30 years, we'll probably see those power plants. That's how the sun produces naturally. And that's an abundant power source for planet Earth to come, basically, right? Absolutely. It's going to be probably not cheap, but it's much safer than nuclear fission, where, the reaction cannot basically get out of control when cooling equipment fails, basically, because you basically pull a plug and it stops. And so it's a much more controllable, safer power. It also doesn't produce as much nuclear waste as nuclear fission. So I see that as like the long-term goal. But in the interim, I mean, decentralized or on-site power generation will play a big role in catching up with the exploding power demand. I mean, the power demand is growing not just because of electric mobility, but also because the standards of living are increasing in many parts of the world, and there's just not enough power to go around. And so instead of building so many new coal plants and fossil fuel power plants, I think the renewables will take a bigger portion of that. And so that's where I see our opportunity until fusion is available.
Absolutely. Hagen, are you raising any money?
We are raising money right now. I mean, we basically are self-funded. I mean, all the money that went into Chava Wind has come almost exclusively from, my partner in Germany, Michael, and myself. And so we're looking for, ideally a strategic partner that can help us bring this product into mass production, basically. So we are in a round of funding at the moment. And so this will, obviously be the last the first raise we do outside of our own money, basically, and will also be the last because, with our business model where we don't invest into our own mass production heavily, we don't have to because we're working with partners. We can basically bring this into commercialization with that round and then be cash flow positive thereafter.
Understood. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us for this episode of Conversations from the Deal Room with Hagen Ruff, CEO of Chava Wind. We look forward to sharing their materials with you. Their website will be in the links below. And Hagen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.